So, Ani, bonjour, and welcome everybody. I'm Jan Hare, Dean of the Faculty of Education at the University of British Columbia. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the 2025 Dean's Distinguished Lecture, featuring renowned scholar, artist, and activist, Dr. Leanne Betasamosake Simpson. This lecture series highlights the essential work taking place within our faculty while engaging us with pressing opportunities and challenges that are shaping education today. And I am delighted to see such a strong turnout this evening. We have a large number of registrants, I believe over 500 this evening. Your attendance underscores the importance of tonight's conversation and the impact of our distinguished keynote speaker, whom I will introduce shortly. Before we begin, I'd like to note that Zoom live captioning has been enabled to support accessibility. You can turn it on by selecting Show Captions at the bottom of your Zoom window or under More if it is not immediately visible. As an Anishinaabe scholar and from Chiging First Nation, I wish to begin by acknowledging that the University of British Columbia's campuses are situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Syilx Okanagan nations. These lands have always been places of learning, teaching, and living, sustained through deep connections to land and community, with legal and social traditions and knowledges that are carried forward across generations in stories, languages, economies, and governance structures. Engaging with Indigenous perspectives invites all of us to consider new ways of relating to the world, broadening our understanding, inspiring reflection, and creating the possibility of more inclusive and connected communities inspired by Indigenous intellectual and cultural knowledges. As a faculty, we are committed to integrating Indigenous knowledges, perspectives, and histories in all we do. Guided by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, we recognize education as vital to this effort, while also acknowledging that it has been used as a tool of harm through the residential school system and ongoing child removal policies. With this awareness, we work to ensure that education becomes a force of healing, respect, and equity, as well as the recognition of Indigenous rights and self-determination. Through our teaching, research, and community engagement, we must cultivate meaningful reconciliation. We must see our commitment as not only articulated, but actioned. Across our programs and within our advanced scholarship and our partnerships, we are creating spaces where Indigenous perspectives are deeply engaged and Indigenous pathways are prioritized. Just as evidence of this action, I want to draw attention to the faculty's new Learn and Earn program that supports Indigenous high school students by providing dual credits for land-based learning and mentorship, providing pathways into teacher education while honoring traditional ways of building knowledge, skills, and cultural connections. And of course, there is NITEP, the faculty's Indigenous Teacher Education Program, who has for more than 50 years been preparing Indigenous educators and leaders across the province of British Columbia, especially in rural and remote areas, by offering a portion of the curriculum at regional field centers. And this enables individuals to stay closer to home, thereby strengthening communities. This year, I'm really excited that we will partner with the Bonaparte First Nation and the Indigenous Institute, Nicola Valley Institute of Technology, through a provincial initiative that is funded by the Ministry of Post-Secondary Education and Future Skills to deliver a community-based Bachelor of Education program. This initiative will allow more learners across the province to complete their teacher education close to home, further increasing the number of First Nations educators in BC's K-12 system. At the graduate level, we offer a Master's of Indigenous Education and a recently launched to SCAL, which is our exciting new doctoral pathway, which creates opportunities for Indigenous scholars and leaders to pursue graduate studies rooted in community, rooted in community and focused on resurgence. And through a new provincial teacher mentorship pilot program led by our faculty, we are supporting teachers in the field, particularly those who are Indigenous and those working in underserved regions of the province, through tailored mentorship and professional development. Together, these initiatives represent a continuum of opportunities in Indigenous education, extending from bridging programs and early entry into teacher preparation through to advanced graduate study and beyond. And you can learn more about these programs on our faculty website or by visiting our recent Truth and Reconciliation Week webpage. And there will be a QR code linking to this information that will be also shared at the end of this event. Our faculty members are also advancing reconciliation and decolonization via research that takes many forms. Some projects are reimagining teaching and learning by integrating Indigenous knowledge, oral traditions, and land-based approaches into the curriculum. Others focus on renewing traditions and cultural practices, connecting children and youth with elders and knowledge keepers, revitalizing games and movement, and fortifying identity through land and water-based activities. Still, others are transforming entire fields, from rethinking mathematics education through Indigenous perspectives to developing Indigenous research methodologies and creating spaces where Indigenous scholarship can thrive. Together, this rich body of work demonstrates that reconciliation in our faculty is not merely symbolic, but a lived practice that shapes both education, teaching, learning, and research. To sustain and expand these initiatives, supporting Indigenous learners, advancing innovative inquiry, and growing partnerships, we must ensure that they have resources to thrive. And so today, I'm really proud to announce the launch of Walk With Us, the Path Towards Reconciliation, a new faculty fundraising initiative. This campaign is dedicated to removing systemic barriers for Indigenous students, strengthening Indigenous-led teaching and research, and deepening our partnerships with Indigenous communities. Funds raised will support initiatives spanning the full spectrum of Indigenous education in the Faculty of Education here at UBC. We will establish new programming for Indigenous learners, making a difference in schools, communities, and organizations. The campaign will also fund Indigenous-led social change fellowships for graduate students and support the creation of an Indigenous social change project hub. In this proposed culturally safe space, Indigenous scholars, knowledge keepers, and community members will collaborate on prioritized research. As well, this hub will support inquiry concerned with truth-telling and knowledge mobilization projects among our scholars, educators, and leaders. We seek to expand our Learn and Earn program, which supports pathways to higher education for Indigenous high school students, given the high demand for this participation in this initiative. Support will also help recruit world-class Indigenous scholars through a new professorship, enable the meaningful participation of Indigenous knowledge keepers as central leaders, and provide essential scholarships and emergency funding for Indigenous students. The campaign will also transform our physical spaces in the faculty. We envision an outdoor Indigenous pedagogy space for land-based learning, ceremony, and storytelling, recognizing the land as a living teacher. These projects will empower Indigenous futures, strengthen communities, and transform education for purposes of relationship, reconciliation, and resurgence. With your support, we can build something lasting, honoring the past, responding to the present, and inspiring the future. and I invite all of you to walk with us on this path of reconciliation. Now, helping us to deepen our commitments to Indigenous education is the Association of Canadian Deans of Education Renewed Accord on Indigenous Education, which was launched this past spring in Toronto. First developed in 2010 under the leadership of Indigenous scholars and leaders across this country. The Accord affirms that Indigenous identities, cultures, languages, values, ways of knowing, and knowledge systems will flourish in all Canadian learning systems. I was honored to co-lead this renewal process with Dean Jennifer Tupper at the University of Alberta, joining with fellow deans, chairs, and directors of education in listening to hundreds of voices across this country, elders, knowledge keepers, leaders, educators, parents, scholars, professionals, community members, and students through consultations, circles, and feedback sessions. And I want to say miigwech, thank you. In fact, chi miigwech, which is a big thank you to all those who shared their insights and experiences. It is their generosity that has shaped this revitalized accord and inspires our work here in the faculty. The renewed accord is not simply a document, it also represents a call to action. It challenges us to move beyond recognition and respect towards responsibility and Indigenous rights, and beyond symbolic gestures towards structural transformation. It affirms Indigenous self-determination, the flourishing of Indigenous languages and knowledges, and the responsibility of institutions to dismantle colonial barriers. At UBC's Faculty of Education, we view this accord as both an inspiration and a mandate. It asks us to reimagine teaching and learning in ways that affirm Indigenous rights and recognize these principles as vital to the future of this country and beyond. It asks us to listen deeply, to imagine differently, and to act courageously. Now, I know that that was seemingly lengthy, and some of you may even be wondering if I just gave the keynote, and I'm going to say certainly not. So tonight, it is my great honor to introduce someone whose work embodies these very principles, Dr. Leanne Betasamosake Simpson. Dr. Simpson is a renowned Michi-Sagig Nishinabeg scholar, writer, musician, and artist who has profoundly shaped conversations about Indigenous thought, resurgence, and decolonization. Through her books, her music, her art, she has given voice to truths that challenge and inspire, helping us imagine new futures rooted in Indigenous knowledge systems. Her recent book, Theory of Water, is a moving exploration of relationships, land, and resurgence, all through water in all its forms. In it, Dr. Simpson invites us to think deeply about our responsibilities to one another and to the natural world, while also embracing the transformative power of Indigenous knowledge and creativity. Dr. Simpson's scholarship, I want to say, is visionary, intensely imaginative, and urgently needed in this moment. And we are honored to welcome her to the Faculty of Education and to learn from her brilliant insights. Following her presentation, we will open the Q&A session, bringing forward many of the thoughtful questions submitted by you, our audience, during the registration process. So now I want to welcome Dr. Simpson.
Chimigwech din her bojo ani kinewaya gidigavijun denawema kinagachia nishnabek oguming nidonjaba negojawani megwadoda Betasamosake Indigenous. Thank you all for coming today. It's so lovely to be together on Zoom. I'm very grateful to Dean Hare and all the folks in her office that have worked so hard to make this lecture happen. I'm also really inspired to learn of all of the initiatives that the Faculty of Education has at UBC in terms of Indigenous resurgence, Indigenous education, and reconciliation. So I really appreciate hearing all about that. I wanted to start tonight by just speaking a little bit about my own educational experiences because I don't get to speak to a Zoom room full of folks that spend so much time, so much of your time thinking, researching, and writing about education. I have the regular sort of Gen X Ontario public school in the 1970s and 1980s experience. I was in the cohort where Ontario was dropping grade 13, and so I was able to do the 5 years of high school in 4 years. I then had the experience of Canadian universities in the 1990s, and things started to diverge for me during my PhD at the University of Manitoba when I began to deliver university courses in remote Indigenous communities in northern Manitoba. So I would fly into the north for a week or two, engaged in condensed delivery courses for Indigenous folks in these remote communities. In my personal life, I've homeschooled my two Anishinaabe children into adulthood. And this, I think, as an educator, was a pretty labor-intensive and profound experience for me because I spent a lot of time thinking about education from within Anishinaabe thought, the present moment, and I had to do that with all different grade levels. We're just going to move this slide along here. There we go. For the past 13 years, I've been involved with the Dechinta Center for Research and Learning in Northern Canada. I'm currently the Vice President of Dechinta and a faculty member. Dechinta is an Indigenous-led, land-based post-secondary education program based out of Yellowknife. We take groups of Northern Indigenous students, their children, and elders out on the land to live together in a learning community following Dene laws and Dene practices. We would spend half the day engaged in land-based activities like fishing, making dry fish, hide tanning, medicine making, canoe making, sewing, trapping and hunting, and then half the day around fires or in a classroom tent with people like me deepening our students' experiences of those learning contexts and talking about things like colonization and colonialism, Indigenous law, storytelling, creative practice, and self-determination. This is a photo of a class that we ran in conjunction with a solidarity gathering that was part of some shirk research that I've been doing. And in addition to our students, we have participants from Palestine, Indigenous folks from Hawaii, Australia. We have some people from France and brown and black organizers and thinkers from Canada and the US. And we are in Yellowknife's Dene territory outside of Yellowknife in this photo. We found the biggest barrier to post-secondary education in the North for Indigenous women was childcare. And so we decided to provide a land-based children's program that we run alongside our adult program when we're in class. So this is a group of students from our Godzea program fishing the net in the winter. We do all of the land-based activities together, and then sort of when we go into the classroom, they go into their own learning space. Our classes have about 10 students in them. We prioritize Northern Indigenous students from the communities we're working with. And these hide tanning photos are from a recent hide tanning course that I taught in Inuvik just in August of this year. Dechinta provides all of the materials, the housing, which is canvas tents or cabins. We provide all the meals, academic support, wellness support, childcare, financial support, gear support, and we work pretty hard to remove as many barriers as possible to post-secondary education for Indigenous students. And we also work very hard to make our programming meaningful for Indigenous, queer, and trans communities. We're aiming to remove as many barriers as possible to education. We are partnered with the University of British Columbia for accreditation, and so our students can complete 5 undergraduate courses and earn a certificate in community and land-based research. And then those credits can be transferred into a degree program or used as a basis of admission for other degree programs. We currently have accredited programs in Yellowknives Dene territory, in Inuvik, in Gwich'in and Inuvialuit territory, in Rankin Inlet in Nunavut, and in the Yukon in Ross River Dene Nation and the Casca Dene Nation in northern BC in the Yukon. So this is a pretty unique set of teaching and learning experiences that I've had, and the vast majority of my teaching has taken place in Indigenous land-based context. So co-teaching with elders, with small groups of Indigenous students on the land. This combined, I think, with a 2-decade-long mentorship with an elder from Curve Lake First Nation, Doug Williams-Baugh, in my own homeland, have shaped my practice of teaching, my theoretical orientation, and my body of work. I'm so proud of these students. They worked so hard. And their hides are a little bit holy, but that's okay. It was their first time. This is a photo of my homeland. My homeland is on the north shore of Lake Ontario between the cities of Toronto and Ottawa. I'm Michi-Sagik in Anishinaabeg. Michi-Sagik means at the mouths of many rivers that drain into Lake Ontario. So we are at the eastern doorway of the Anishinaabe Nation. Every morning, my ancestors got up and they made life. They were makers. They made their political systems and their forms of governance. They made their food systems, their education systems, their healthcare. And what they practiced as families, they practiced as communities and nations. So they scaled these practices up and across and forward and back. These were systems of care, and they were iterative and adaptive. My ancestors were concerned not with making a world, but they were concerned with weaving themselves into the existing natural world and ecological processes that reproduce the planet. And they were concerned with doing this in diverse ways, but in practices that ultimately bring forth more life on the planet. Not just human life, but more life. They were profoundly concerned with the self-determination and the autonomy of all living things that they shared time and space with. They saw life as an interconnected and interdependent collaboration with plants and animals and rivers and lakes and oceans and all of the natural beings that make up our planet and that make up our present moment. A present moment that is birthed from the collapsing of the future and of the past. They knew that this practice of life was a network and that this network was dependent upon a communal practice of deep relationality. They knew that the spiritual and material strands or relations that connect all living things were called an Awendowin, our shared umbilical cord, connecting us to a parent made up of the sum of all of our lives, past, present, and future. The seen and the unseen, the opaque and the transparent, the permeable and the expansive, the cycled and the renewed, the repaired and the re-strengthened. To have a relationship of any kind, an Awendowin is present. And an Awendowin means we do not waste our lives or livings. They knew that the practice of the universe was Wawiyayak, the philosophy of an interwoven system of circularity, a practice of cycling interdependence entwined with relational independence. So my ancestors were weavers. They knitted themselves into the world through practices of kindness and empathy, consent, and accountability. Our present moment, one of climate catastrophe, of ongoing genocide in Gaza, and of genocides in Sudan and Congo, mean that we need to direct our dreams and actions towards making worlds that refuse capitalism and dispossession and the spectacular violences required to maintain them. So today, I want to use our time together as a kind of anti-colonial refuge where we breathe and think and dream together and separately about the worlds we are making in our classrooms, in our research, in our writing, and the worlds that we want to live in. And I'm going to share some excerpts from my most recent book called The Theory of Water. The theory of water refuses the settler colonial state and all of the violences that go into maintaining that state. And it looks towards water as a collaborator to dream, to build, and to make worlds where life is precious, where Palestinian life is cherished, where Islamic and Jewish life are cherished, where Indigenous and Kashmiri and Tibetan and Muslim and Black life are cherished, where trans life is cherished, and where we all care for the planet that sustains us. This is the first excerpt. In 1991, Anishinaabe artist Rebecca Belmore made a 2-meter wide wooden megaphone in response to the so-called Oka crisis, a Mohawk uprising to defend their sacred pines and a burial ground from becoming an 18-hole golf course. Belmore wanted people to address the land directly, much like our ancestors had, and to experience political protest as poetic action. Over the next few years, Belmore traveled with the piece, setting it up on reserves, on the shore, in sacred places, and at sites of resistance. Along the way, she often slept beside this in her van. And in Anishinaabe the piece was called Ayumi Ewach Omamawoan, translated into English as speaking to their mother. As she traveled and moved this piece around Canada, it became an instrument invoking a sort of gathering space for Indigenous people to amplify our voices and speak directly to the land. Our old people, Rebecca and mine, had and have an intimate relationship with the land and the water. They spoke to the sun in the mornings and to the moon at night as cherished relatives. They visit with water lilies and Labrador tea before they pick them to make medicine. They pray to the ones that had passed on to the spirit world, and they pray to the spiritual beings that lived in their worlds. They spoke and dreamed of beavers and muskrats before they harvested them. They made offering to whitefish before setting nets and to the lakes and rivers for safe passage. They were in constant dialogue with the living things that make up their world. And that's saying something because Anishinaabe people aren't really known to be chatty people. Many Anishinaabe people still do this while they're harvesting, while making medicines, or in ceremony. And for many of us, the sound waves of our voices, the vibrations made from the instrument of our body, are an affecting force in the universe. And so this is how I understand this installation. At first, Belmore installed the piece on the land outside of galleries, outside of the confines of the so-called white box, and into the network of living things that contain the potentiality of Indigenous people. And in this way, the performance installation became a gathering site, a communal meaning-making project, and a space that generates knowledge, which is what education is all about. Ayumi Ewach Omamamoan placed bodies with the relationality of land and water and asked us to relate through sound and listening. When I was writing the book, I looked back at photographs and videos from the first journeys of Ayumi Ewach Omamamoan, And I got a strong sense of how the piece brought people together. At Fort William First Nation, it faced Lake Superior, the Wiggins Bay blockade in northern Saskatchewan. The piece is surrounded by friends and family and children and elders. There's fires, there's visiting, there's sharing of food and stories. And people took turns speaking through the megaphone, really embracing the piece, speaking their hearts and minds, their bodies and voices, becoming kind of at one with the piece and having multiple meanings generated. Searching the internet, there are only a few recordings of what Indigenous people said into the megaphone. And looking back now in this era where we're recording everything, that's kind of one of the lovely parts of the piece for me, because the thousands of conversations that took place between people in the land were private and between the speakers, the people who were gathered around the sculpture, and the universe. They were rehearsed, they were unrehearsed in English, in Anishinaabe there were songs, there were prayers, the things that were said, and there were things that were unsaid. So it was sort of a collective accounting of that moment after the 1990 uprising in a collective way. The point of the piece was not just the content of the speeches or even the megaphone itself as a piece of conceptual art, but that the meaning was made through this practice of speaking and listening, through traveling the land, through bringing people together to engage in the practice of speaking and listening to non-human forms of life on reserves, in towns and cities, and at Indigenous land reclamation sites. When I look back at the piece now, I think back to the circumstances that led Balmore to be compelled to build a huge megaphone so that our ancestors and our relatives could hear our voices amongst the noise of capitalism. I think of the importance of finding words, of speaking, and of deep listening in our present moment. Well, that piece still really resonates with me today. The work gave birth to siblings in 2017 in a series called Wave Sound, and this is one of those sculptures. Revisiting and inverting the concept of the megaphone, Belmar made four sculptures varying in shape and form to amplify the sound of water at the shoreline. The sculptures were installed in Banff, Alberta, at Grouse Mourne in Newfoundland, and in Anishinaabe territory. One was installed at Puckasaw near Marathon, Ontario, and another in Georgian Bay. Instead of inviting us to speak, though, this time, Belmore invited us to listen. Wave sound is an invitation to gather at the shore, to sit down, and to use our bodies to hear wind and rock and sand, maybe even mosquitoes, and the durational rhythm of waves. I don't look at wave sound, although I could because they're aesthetically very beautiful, but instead I become enmeshed in wave sound, placing my body on the land to quiet, to listen beside nebe or water, to listen through nebe, to listen with nebe, a being that changes form from liquid to solid to gas, that travels the sky world, that moves underground, that's inside and outside of my body, an ancient formation of molecules that has been the same since the beginning of this world. Water is a fugitive that erodes and escapes containment, and one that we simply can't live without. My ancestors spoke to their ancestors through the sound of rushing water. So it's one of the many reasons that hydro dams and interpretive centers and lift locks are so irritating to us because they close off those channels of communications. This sort of rushing water is a sort of portal to another world. The sound of rushing water and these waves of energy is where human hearing gets altered and where they're places where spiritual beings live or where certain events happened. Those sounds of water moving were also normalized. So the idea that Balmore would have to stop us, remind us, and amplify those sounds so that we could hear them, I think would be startling to my ancestors. So we're at the shore, we're quiet, we're listening. Through these rehearsals, wave sound amplifies the voices of water to cut through the noise of colonialism. It works in concert with my great grandparents praying and carrying water, and with those yet to be born to become a practice. Together with my cochlea and my auditory nerve, my mind and my heart, wave sound transforms from instrument to belonging as water, Belmore, and all the life she has gathered work alongside me to generate meaning and inspire new worlds. And so I take Belmore's invitation seriously. In our present moment, what does it mean for all of us to listen to water? What does it mean to, as Dion Brand asks us, to believe in water? This slide I borrowed from my sister Ansley. It's a Christy Belcourt piece of art that is the album cover for Ansley's record called She Fell from the Sky. And I wanted to use it for the second excerpt from Theory of Water, which is an origin story. It's an origin story that Michi Sagik, an Anishinaabeg origin story that I've heard Doug Williams tell a number of times. I helped him write it down in his book, which is called Michi Sagik Anishinaabeg. This is our territory, but this is very much my version. The story starts with Jouet Manado, which is a benevolent energy that loves living things unconditionally. Jouet Manado sometimes gets translated as God, but that's not exactly right. And Jouet Manado is at the same time all the genders and none at all. So this is really, really one sentence into our origin story, then my mind is already blown because the precursor to life, to world building, it wasn't a plan or a campaign or an action or even an intention of something better. It was Jouet Manado. It was love, not a fleeting romantic kind of love, but a deep sense of care, of hope, of truth and kindness, a loving anyway, and a loving in all the ways. So before the idea of our world, before the making of the world, the inspiration, the know-how, the intercommunal creation, there was care and there was love. And I think a lot about this when I'm teaching because I think that when I'm teaching, I'm building a learning community. I'm building a world. And I think about that first ingredient is that unconditional love and care. So love is the necessary precursor to world building. I understand love encoded in the word jouer as being unconditional, as an organizing force, emotion, and an ethic of caring. Jouer is a love that is an ethic and is animated within our relations, and from there propels customs of kindness that generate empathy and systems of care for all forms of life that make up the world. It's also an organizing force and architecture in the Anishinaabe cosmos, one amongst many other organizing forces, but an organizing force nonetheless. Jouet Meadow had a dream of the world, the one that we know today, with the oceans and the rivers and the forests and the deserts, the mountains and the glaciers, the plants and animals and humans. And within Anishinaabe culture, with dreams and visions come responsibilities. And so Jouet Manado knew that they had to make that dream happen. The earth happened and everything was created instantly and everything was beautiful. And this went on for a long time. Everyone was getting along. And in Anishinaabe we call this Kina Bamadzawin, a big cycling of kindness. Everyone was kind. But Doug taught me that this peace didn't last. And one day things started to go very wrong. Everything died off, and no one knew why. And he used to say, it could be that life is actually not that easy to keep. It could be that life is fragile. It could be that in making a life, we don't always get it right. It could be that in isolation, no individual or community has the knowledge we need to build worlds. It could be that world building is struggle. Most things died off. All of the earthbound life died and was gone, and only the sun and the great waters were saved. This bothered Joey Manado, and they were upset. This part of the story always resonates with me, sort of sitting on the edge of climate collapse and genocide and overwhelming world endings. I imagine indigiqueer Joey Manado in the sky world, scrolling on their phone, watching Netflix in bed under a weighted blanket, feeling bothered because the place that they had created got into trouble. But Joey Manado doesn't stay in this place for very long. The spirits that lived in the sky world went to Joey Manado and they asked if they could help. So the first time Joey Manado created the world, they did it alone and it didn't work. Joey Manado was in no state to go back to the earth and try again. So when help was offered, they agreed. They asked another spirit who was different in character and work than themselves to try. They asked Gijago Kwe, or Sky Woman, to go down to the earth to see if creation could be repaired. Gijago Kwe's work was not easy. The first time she tried, her two children died and she was consumed by grief. Something was not working right with Joey Manado's dream and things were not coming together. Gijago Kwe went back to the sky world to visit with Joey Manado and to try to figure out what happened. I imagine the two felt a pretty deep despair, felt pretty frustrated having both tried and failed. They're now both grieving, stuck in the fog of bereavement, unable to see clearly. In the meantime, back on Earth, a great flood happened, covering the earth with water, washing over and nurturing the land, and changing the physical surface of the earth. Water, or Nebe, saw the problem and did the work only they could do in hopes that it might move things along. Nebe didn't have to act. Nebe was thinking beyond themselves and their own responsibilities. Nebe was living in kindness, witnessing and empathizing with the struggle of both Joey Manado and Gijago Kwe. They were witnessing and listening beyond themselves and towards a new collectivity. Nibi listened and responded to the present moment. Within Anishinaabe world making, water is crucial. For humans, we first exist in a water world, a world that meets all of our needs and where we learn what it feels like to be safe. Water that I breathe in becomes a constituent that makes up most of my body. Water that I breathe out becomes part of someone else's body. Water travels the world over, moving easily through land and air and soil and rock and bodies. Said in another way, Nibi continually violates the home spaces of everything on the planet. It might take a very long time, but Nibi always escapes the container. Nibi reminds us that we can build all the containers and enclosures that we want, including our own bodies, but there are world-making forces that are planetary and that are beyond us. In fact, if Nibi is enclosed, they work away, seemingly gently, incredibly persistent, and unsuspecting until the enclosure is eroded away and then undercut or an arch or a hole appears as chasm and rupture. Nibby never gives up. They keep at it at the beginning when it seems absolutely impossible, through the years of seeing absolutely no progress to the point where they think they might be imagining or wishing a transformation, through the hopelessness of incremental change, until finally, after everyone but Nibby has given up across an incomprehensible time frame for living things, there's a miraculous rupture. Perhaps world making then is the practice of communal struggle. Joey Manado and Gijago Kwe continued their visit in the sky world. They comforted each other. Joey Manado encouraged Gijago Kwe and told her not to give up and to keep trying. Gijago Kwe eventually makes the decision to go back to the earth and to try again. She encounters Nibe's flood, this catastrophic upheaval that has left the world in a completely different place than when she was last there. So here's the world. It's only water. There's no land. There is no land back because there are no homelands and there are no humans. In time, Gijago Kwe found animals in the water that had survived the flood because they could swim or fly. Things like loons, beavers, and muskrats. Chi Mikanak, the snapping turtle, came to the surface and offered Gijago Kwe a place to land and rest. And so that's the image you've been looking at. The animals Gijago Kwe found needed help. They needed care. They also needed a place to rest because they had been swimming or flying endlessly for days. Maybe they weren't even thinking of making a world at this point. Maybe they were only thinking of caring for the ones that were near exhaustion. Maybe they worked together to meet the material needs of their immediate community, which was just a place to rest at this point. Each being thinking about what they could give up to support the others. So Gijago Kwe rested on the back of the turtle with beavers and muskrats and other animals, and they created a communal place of refuge. Over time, Gijago Kwe noticed the design on the turtle's back. She ran her finger around the edge and she felt the rim of the shell, 13 parts in the middle and 28 parts around the edge. She was able to feel its meaning because her body cycled each moon, and her body's practice of cycles enabled her to see the moon cycles on the back of the turtle. The turtle's shell was a map of cycles, 13 months or moons, 28 days each. Turtles still carry that map today, as does the moon and as do people who menstruate. The turtle was showing Gijago Kwe that what was missing in Jouet Manado's design was cycling and renewal. Not even Jouet Manado is perfect because the job of Jouet Manado isn't perfection. The job of Jouet Manado is unconditional love. After a while, the loon, a bird that can swim and float, offered to dive to the bottom to try to get some earth so that they could maybe move on to the next step of world making. The loon was gone for a very, very long time and finally floated to the surface, drowned. The loon tried so hard, it died trying. Same thing happened with the otter. Same thing happened with the beaver. Although when I was telling this story to my kids when they were little, I faked that they didn't die. They were just exhausted and they got revived back to life. Next came muskrat. same thing. Tried too hard and floated to the surface. Gijago Koi, though, noticed that they had a handful of earth, and she helped put that handful of dirt onto the turtle's back. They danced and they sang around that handful of dirt, and the earth grew into mountains and streams and lakes, and then into clouds and wind and rain, trees and beautiful animals. And this world, the world that we all live in together, was created. So sometimes there is a larger benefit to others in plowing through. Gijago Koi at this point goes back to the sky world and she becomes the moon. She becomes the one to watch over and regulate the cycles and cycling needed to bring forth more life on Earth. And her form cycles visually as she reflects through her phases the cyclical nature of the universe. So there's always sort of a cheat code for Anishinaabe people every night. We can look up and be reminded that that cycling and renewal and interconnectivity and that circularity of Wawiyak is so important in the creation of worlds. Some Anishinaabe people call the moon or Gijago Kwai grandmother, Kukum or Nokomis. Others call her Debik Gizis, which means the night sun. We were all given the responsibility of Mino Bamadzuin, which often gets translated into living the good life. Mino means good, and Bamadzuin is a practice of living. But Winona LaDuke translated it in one of her earlier works as a continuous rebirth. So we were given the responsibility of living in a way that contributes to a continuous rebirth of all of the living things on the planet. We were given the responsibility not to remake the world, but to fit into those complex networks of interconnection and interdependence that make up the planet. So this is a wintry photo of what's to come in the Gojawani or in Peterborough, Ontario. This is a photo of Jackson Creek, which is a sort of small urban park about 3 blocks from where I live. And it's exactly kind of the same place as that first photo. And this is my third excerpt from Theory of Water. So Jackson Creek is a creek down the street from where I live in Peterborough, Ontario. It flows into the man-made Little Lake in Peterborough and then into the Otonabee River and eventually into Chinabish or Lake Ontario. This is the trail that is alongside the creek, and I like to run on this trail and hike on it during the spring, summer, and fall. And in the winter, I like to ski on it. Jackson Creek is by most accounts an unremarkable urban creek, I imagine, much like every other urban creek in North America. And it is the body of water that I spend the most time with every day. Today, the creek is beginning to freeze after the big first snowfall of the winter brought nearly 30 centimeters of snow to us. I was up early today on the snowmobile during passes along the trail, compacting the heavy, wet snow so that possibly tomorrow another driver could attach the groomer. I started helping groom the ski trail during one of the pandemic winters. I volunteered at first just to keep my snowmobile skills up when I'm in the South so that when I return to the North, I remember how to drive it and I don't embarrass the Anishinaabe. Grooming certainly helped with that. but those technical skills were eclipsed by something else. Nearly every day when I was out on the snowmobile in Jackson Creek, the snow was different. I became drawn to this process of sintering. When a snowflake falls from the sky and lands on the earth, it immediately begins or continues to transform as it forms bonds at temperatures below zero. So this isn't a melting process, but it forms bonds with its neighboring snowflakes or crystals to create the fabric of a snowpack. And of course, Canadians know this because we're used to snow. And if we're feeling lazy and we don't get out to shovel our walks, when the fluffy snow first falls, we wait till the next day. We know that we have a trickier job to do because the snow is heavier, and that's because it has sintered. So sintering is a joining process. It's a transformative communal process that creates a fabric of former snowflakes bonded to one another. It's the process of changing from a singular angular snowflake to a more rounded form of bonded crystals or a snowpack, a denser, more compact linked formation. As the snow sinters, it settles and becomes denser, stronger, saggier under the influence of gravity. Sintering is slow deformation. As a groomer, there are lots of factors that influence the sintering process: temperature, humidity, time of day, weather, who is using the trail, and how. I'm not thinking of any of these things each morning when I'm on the snowmobile grooming the trail. I think of only this idea that the first thing that a snowflake does when it falls to the land from the sky world is to join bonds, actual physical bonds with its neighbors. Snowflakes weave themselves into their environment in a way that doesn't destroy their neighbors and in a way that doesn't destroy themselves. Sintering is bonding, building coalitions with your neighbors. Those coalitions mean that packed sintered snow on the trail has a staying power and remains long after spring has melted the snow around it. Snowflakes start out as a single nucleated dust particle that attracts water droplets that in turn freeze and accrete into a crystal form. The temperature and humidity in the sky world mold it into a complex shape as it moves through the atmosphere. No two are the same, and when they act en masse and in commune, they can form magnificent storms, upheavals, and blankets. When they act en masse and in commune to form those magnificent storms, they can bring our lives and our worlds to an absolute standstill. When snowflakes arrive in their new environment, the first thing that they do is center. The first thing that they do is to find a way to belong. So, those are three excerpts from Theory of Water. Theory of Water was published by Alchemy, which is an imprint of Knopf, Canada, that is run by Dion Brandt, who is one of the editors of Theory of Water, along with Lynn Henry. And that's a little glimpse to what the book is about. Miigwech.
Sure. Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay. Miigwech, or I should say Chimigwech, Leanne, uh, for your presentation and the stories. I think the stories that you've shared with us, and I'm going to say your work. I first read your work this summer. Well, The Theory of Water. I'm going to say I read this summer. Of course, read your work in your earlier work as well. But The Theory of Water, I so appreciated reading it this summer. I was really thinking about my own work in leadership and thinking about I'm going to say the cultivation of leadership practices in ways that draw from Indigenous, I'm going to say land relations. And so reading your work was really pushed me to think about the notions of leadership, I'm going to say in different kinds of ways and drawing on land and the practices of the land in terms of my own leadership. So all that is to say, really appreciated you introducing us and bringing us three excerpts to the work. I noticed that I'm going to say I noticed that from your previous work and thinking about that you really shift from your previous work focusing really on the land. There was a really land-based focus to that work, and now you've come to one of water, to a focus on water in this work. And I guess I'm really interested to hear about how this shift then came about.
That's a really good question because I think as Anishinaabe Kwe, I'm late to the party around water. In our culture, water is super important, and it's one of the responsibilities of Anishinaabe women in ceremonies. We've seen Josephine Mandaman the water walkers, doing lots of work for a number of years. Autumn Pelche speaking out against the water, and so yeah, I was very concerned with land. And I think Indigenous scholars have been very concerned with land for a very long time for obvious reasons. But I think there was different points of my life where I started to think about water, and I started to think about ways, water as a teacher, water as an embodied practice. And through thinking alongside Rebecca Belmore and her work, I started to think about what I could learn from water's embodied global practice, this huge cycling, this idea that the same amount of water has been present since the beginning of the earth. As a Anishinaabe person, the Great Lakes, right, are really,
Mhm.
really important to us, and our elders teach us that those are sort of the internal organs of our parent or our mother, the earth. And so a lot of our land-based practices, whether it's wild rice or it's sugar bush, relate to water. And so I was looking to water as a teacher. I was looking to water as a connector, as something that links me to every other living thing on the planet. Yeah.
And I do really and again I'm as an Anishinaabe as well. I'm going to say how much I appreciated the language, so much of the language resonating through and the stories that resonate through, and so I've enjoyed that reading that. And your water really, sorry, your writing really helps us look towards water, and I'm going to say our constant interaction even with water through, I'm going to say through your own experience and water in all its forms, with different excerpts taking up ice, snow, liquid, and even our own breath. I want to think about Rebecca Belmore's installation and this notion of listening. How is it that we can get educators to listen to water in the way you have? Like I'm thinking, you think about a teacher as a connector. You're talking about it. How do we help educators or students? You're talking about your own work with students in the Dechinta Center and the work you do there. Um, how might educators listen to water or believe in water in the ways that you ask us to consider in the theory of water?
So one of the things that I've done in working with students around water is to show that same slide of Speaking to Their Mother by Rebecca Belmore and asking students to write what they would do to speak to the earth as sort of a writing exercise. And in North America, I would often give students like 10 minutes to come up with something to say to the land. Um, when I was in northern Scandinavia with Sápmi writers, they were like 10 minutes. We can't write anything in 10 minutes. We're going to need 2 hours. So it was like, okay. So with whatever audience I'm working with, sort of um, a certain amount of time where people can kind of just free write, and then doing the same thing with the listen to water. So what did the water tell you when you were listening? Also taking students to the shore, whether it's a creek or a river or a lake or the ocean, and asking them to listen to water and then write about what they're hearing. Has it the pieces that people have come up with have been really, really, really incredible. And I think that that's one really easy way of just orienting ourselves to water as a teacher.
Yeah. And I really like the idea too of like for myself, I think about my recollections. Just the remembrances of my time on the water, in Temagami, up in Temagami, we'd spend all day at Finlayson Point Park with my cousins, and we'd just be in that water all a day,
Mm.
and also playing TV tag on the beach. But I also just think about, my mom is from the Bear Island First Nation, and all those times I was sitting on the dock and yeah, in the evening, swatting off the mosquitoes, but sometimes fishing and just the hovering of the flies and all those things, sort of water spiders and all those things, sort of interacting with the water, and so just your work made me brought back some of those memories, and so I found that really I really appreciated that. I want to talk a little bit about the Anishinaabe origin story of Joy Manido and Gijik Kwe. And of course, I've heard our creation stories with other variations, and appreciate how our creation stories really form our understanding of the world. As I was telling you about my own, I've been thinking about our creation story in terms of leadership and how distributed forms of leadership, and thinking about some of the practices of Indigenous leadership that are within our origin story. Um, but really thinking about how you talk, your emphasis on thinking about making a world in which the story does for us, and how do we, I guess, how do we make a world? How do we make a world that is attentive to Indigenous perspective, Indigenous thought, um, that embodies that kind of care and love of our land and of water, right? So how do we make that world, or maybe it's how do we engage learners with to engage with land and love with this sorry with land and water with this kind of love and care.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think going back to it's so exciting to be in conversation with with Anishinaabe Kwe. We're both so excited. Um, but at the shore is a place where Anishinaabe people learn about accountability and consent, because the shore is made up of overlapping worlds. You've got the land world, you've got the water world, and you've got the sky world. And anytime you've got overlapping worlds, there's a potential for lots of conflict. But by practicing consent and by practicing accountability and by figuring out how to live together in a good way, which is what you learn at the shore, is I think the way that you figure out how to take care of each other. So I like that in teaching and in a classroom, you can sort of set up some of those practices as a group in your learning community, and within Anishinaabe thought, those are the practices that expand outward to building more than just a classroom, but to building a world. So I think one of the things that I love about all of our different creation stories, and we have a lot of different creation stories, a lot of different versions of creation stories. But the idea, I think, of our stories is that people can see themselves inside the stories, and people can identify and feel affirmed with some of the things that are happening in the stories. And so it's not just a myth or a legend. These are the ways that our ancestors encoded our theory and our practices of life are encoded in these stories, how we treat each other. And this idea that together you can build something really spectacular if you take care of all of the species that you're sharing time and space with is, I feel like, a very profound teaching for me in this moment. Um, and I think that that's why I'm so drawn to that story.
Yeah, yeah. Again, I'm going to say your story of sintering. It's so much of your work reminded me of home. I'm Anishinaabe living
Mhm.
out here on Musqueam territory, and so much of the work reminded me of home and brought these really good memories for me. And I think about kind of that evening time we'd be out, and these big snowflakes that are falling, and it just felt, feeling this kind of sense of peace when they fall in, and,
Mhm.
but just how that bonding, or that how snowflakes then come together, and how you describe sintering as that the process of the snowflakes coming together, forming kind of a fabric, if you will, together. And so I'm just hoping you can speak a little more about sintering, and the way that we can create that kind of fabric. How do we build collectives? How do we build solidarity? How do we build these forms of organization that can then, I'm going to say, build this kind of advocacy towards water security, sustainability, sustainable futures, um, and thinking about centering in that way.
So if we go back to sort of the beginning part of the lecture in Dene territory in my work at Dechinta, um, that's essentially what we're trying to do, build a learning community based on Dene values and Dene practices led kind of by elders. And it looks so beautiful in the photographs, and it is so beautiful. But as the instructor on site, it's also a huge exercise in learning how to live together, in learning how to repair relationships, in learning how to make collective decisions, in learning how to work through conflict. Because when you're out on the land and people have a big conflict over who isn't maybe carrying their weight, whose turn it is to chop firewood, whose turn it is to go and get water, the community can fall apart really quickly, and it can become quite dangerous if you're not taking care of each other in that way. So I think a lot of the learning that happens at Dechinta is actually what you're talking about. It's how do we relate to each other? How do we center? How do we form a collectivity where we're all contributing? How are we all being leaders based on our own self-determination and our own gifts, and contributing in a positive way to the community? And that's something that in sort of my daily life I can get away with not doing, but when I'm on the land, I can't get away with not putting a lot of energy and a lot of thought into that. And I always come back to this one time. I was out on an island in Great Slave Lake with a group of students and elders, and one student had come to us and had a lot of mobility problems. So she had a young baby, and she was having difficulty getting over all the kind of Canadian Shield rocks. And so we arranged to have ski poles come out. But one of the elders noticed her struggling up the step to our classroom tent. And so the next day, when we went to have class again, I came with the student, and he had built a step. So there was no meeting, there was no assigning of tasks. He saw what the problem was and had the skills to kind of scavenge for wood around our camp and fix the problem. And that is such an enormous kind of demonstration, I think, of both centering and leadership. seeing what needs to be done and doing it in this quiet way that was full of humility, and that made this person's life and our community therefore stronger. So I think one of the things that happened before I started writing theory of water was that my mentor, my elder Doug Williams, passed away, and so that's a very I was grieving. It's a very, very sad thing when our elders pass away because they carry this amazing body of knowledge, that's oral and that's about practice and that doesn't exist sort of in other contexts. You can't go to the library and get the knowledge that an elder carries. So one of the things that I was trying to do and a lot of other people was is take in as much of that knowledge that he had while he was still alive. So this practice of going out and grooming a ski trail is not a particularly Anishinaabe practice, right? But I was engaged in this practice to see if I could learn something directly from the land, given all of the context and knowledge that I had been given by Doug. And that's when this idea of centering came to me, because it seems like a very, very important practice that my ancestors and your ancestors would have just sort of done inherently, but it's a practice that I think can help students belong in a classroom. It can help us feel like we belong in the place that we're living in, and it's ultimately a caretaking practice that bonds us to our neighbors. So a it seemed like what the snow was doing scientifically was an amazing teacher for how to live in the world.
And I'm thinking about again going to visit my mother, and I think about you're right. We're not, it's not Anishinaabe to be grooming ski trails, but if you think about first creating that pathway for cars to come across the lake, right?
Right.
Starts as a skidoo, and then people are sort of planting the cedar branch for people then to keep following to to create that trail. And yeah. Um, uh, I guess uh, what does thinking about theory of water, where do you want to go next with this?
I think that I don't know. I feel like water is so vast, and I think that obviously within indigenous knowledge systems, you learn things very, very slowly, and it takes kind of decades of thinking about things. So in some ways, I think I could write the book over and over and over again
Yeah.
for the rest of my life and still be learning new things. I think that one thing that I am thinking about is in a more international sense. So how water is this connector that connects me to every other living thing on the planet. Water is something that all cultures, all peoples, all species have a relationship to. We all have a piece of that knowledge. And so things like sintering and the embodied practice of water seem to be something that are really important in terms of a grounded solidarity, or in terms of thinking about how I'm connected to other movements and other communities in the world. And so I think that I will continue to think along those lines. Um, and who knows what I'll come up with next.
I thought maybe you were going to say, okay, I've done land-based focus, now theory of water. I thought maybe you're going to go to the sky world next.
I mean, that's a very good idea. Yeah, I feel like, I think I also sort of started thinking about water more intensely during the pandemic when those water droplets were connecting all of us. And I guess, yeah, it does make sense that I need to go to the sky next.
There's yeah, something else for you to take on.
Yeah, oh my God.
I'm going to say I could pour us a cup of tea, I wish, and keep having a conversation here. But I know there are a few questions that have been submitted, so, well,
Sure.
more than a few. So I want to be able to ask a few of these. Um, let's see. I'll start with and I one about here we go. How can we move beyond representation to truly dismantle colonial education? Um, and what ideas do you have for indigenizing learning in ways that honor nations across Canada while avoiding pan-Indigenous approaches?
That's a great question. And I think there's always there are lots and lots of local based First Nations, Métis communities, Inuit communities, all across Canada. So I think doing that research and connecting to the people, the First Nations people, the Indigenous people in your local area is really important. Figuring out what the kind of issues that they're dealing with is important. Figuring out that history and the cultural component, thinking about what's going on in your own community and bringing that into the classroom, I think is important. I think being outside and doing kind of land-based work, even if it's in urban areas, can be a way of really quickly undoing a lot of the assumptions of a colonial education. Um, Kids connecting to the land and finding meaning in those local environments, I think is a really important first step in terms of connecting to local Indigenous communities.
I want to come back to the start where you talked a little bit about your own education and then the work at the Litichinta um, center and the work that you're doing there with both the students, and then it was wonderful to see how the young kids as well. The children are also engaged in the land
Yeah.
as the classroom. So I guess the last question here is, what gives you hope about the next generation of students and how they're engaging with Indigenous knowledges and decolonial thinking?
I mean, things have really changed since I was in public school in high school. My dad was a high school teacher, but there was sort of no Indigenous content in the curriculum at that time. And if there was, we were not appearing in a good light. So I think things have really changed in that way. I think that Indigenous writers and Indigenous scholars and Indigenous artists over the last 20 years have created huge bodies of work. And so there are so many resources now, whether that's film, video, music, literature that can be brought into the classroom. And I think that that's really, really exciting. I think that hope is something that I sort of always think of Miriam Kaba when people ask about hope, because I think it's a discipline and it's something that has to be cultivated. And I think it's very easy with everything that's going on in the world to not feel hopeful. But I think for me, I have to kind of separate the days that I'm not feeling hopeful and do the work anyway, and foster inspiration and foster hope in students and the people around me by being able to see the ways that we have progressed in the last 20 years, the way that things have changed, the opportunities that you spoke of at the beginning of the opening in terms of reconciliation and resurgence, and and seeing those cracks of light, and helping students kind of see those cracks of light and grow those cracks of light. So I see hope as a practice, not just an emotion, and it's something that we have to cultivate and practice.
Mhm. I have time, I think, for one more question. And so I think a lot of our participants here today are very familiar with your scholarship. But I'm also, your work in music, your other creative works. What has been the most transformative lesson for you? Like, what's been the most transformative lesson you have learned on your creative journey? What has surprised you?
I think that I'm a lifelong learner. And so one of the things that I came to performing music later in life.
Yeah.
And it's very, very valuable to go from being a so-called expert or academic in something to right back to not knowing what you're doing and figuring it out. and having to find mentors and find teachers and having to work hard and having to study. And that was really useful for me to do, I think, later in life, because I remembered what it was like to be a student and to not be very good at something and to want to have that desire to be good at something. So that was really beneficial to, I think, my scholarship and my writing and also my teaching is to I recently, in the last couple of years, I decided I was going to learn how to surf. And so that was a ridiculous thing to do so late in life. But again, I think this love of learning um, and of putting myself in a position where I'm not good at stuff is really beneficial for me as a teacher and as an academic.
And I like that because it's sort of speaking to taking risks, right?
Yes.
And I think that's so much what we want educators to do often who are afraid to take on Indigenous education or work with Indigenous perspectives and histories and, right, afraid of making mistakes, perhaps, for a lot of reasons. And so I really appreciate the lesson of risk taking and not being afraid to try these things. So
Mm.
thank you for that. And I just want to encourage all our folks out there, if you haven't had an opportunity to read The Theory of Water, please do, please purchase it. It's a wonderful read, and it just in so many lessons that it offers us, I think, both personally, professionally, and work that you can certainly share in your own teaching and other places. So I just want to say miigwech, Leanne, for sharing your wisdom and creativity with us this evening. Um, your words really remind us that how we can live in relationship to one another, to the land, and to the generations who will follow. And you've really challenged us to think with imagination and courage, and also responsibility. And I was really drawn to that in the creation story. And so as we close tonight's lecture, I just want to remind everybody that reconciliation and decolonization is not the work of a few, that this is shared responsibility for all of us. Each of us has a role to play in dismantling colonial structures, honoring Indigenous knowledges, and investing in spaces where Indigenous voices and leadership can then thrive. As we do this work, we all benefit. Like when we do this work, we all benefit. Decolonizing education does not diminish anyone. It actually enriches us all. It opens new ways of seeing and knowing, strengthens our communities, and creates a more just, compassionate, and sustainable future for us. Thank you, everybody. Miigwech to everyone for joining us. Please stay, for those interested in staying informed about our upcoming events and latest developments in the faculty. I want to encourage you to explore our programs and initiatives by following us on social media, visiting our websites, and even subscribing to our triannual newsletter, and links will be sent in a follow-up email. So on behalf of the Faculty of Education, miigwech, chi-miigwech, all of you for being part of this meaningful conversation and for your commitment to advancing education as a force for social good. Have a wonderful evening.